Hi there, welcome to episode 81. This is the inaugural episode. And what you'll find here is that this is actually a clip from a longer interview I had recorded, right? The whole thing about episode 81 is how to create content at scale that positions you for that next step you want to take in your career. And what I'm doing with this channel is showing you exactly how I use this process to make my own content. And I've been doing this for a while now, so I figured why not use this as an opportunity to demonstrate exactly how I do it. So I have created in Claude, actually I've done it in multiple different LLM platforms, but in Claude I've created a project that's sole job is to act as a podcast host. It's an advocate on behalf of my audience. Its sole purpose is to dig deeper and to draw more value from the things I want to talk about so that it's aimed specifically at the problems I solve for the audience. And so I sat down with the idea that I wanted to create an episode that shows exactly how I do this, from one long form piece of content to create individual pieces of micro content across different platforms in a way that makes it super easy to do this. And so I sat down for that first episode. It was a little over an hour long. Once I had some technical difficulties, I cleaned those up and took out some of the filler words. But mostly, as far as the content is concerned, it is uncut. And it was an hour and a half long. And then I took that and cut it into three separate episodes, right? And it's not strictly just a part one, part two, part three. It largely flows in that way, but there were places where I jumped around from topic to topic and some things fit better with others. And so I created them around a specific idea or a theme. And so while they're largely in order, there are places where it pulls something from the end and pulls it back under here because it fits with that subject matter. These first three episodes will be that, where I've taken one long form, 71 minutes, I think was the total running time of the full video. And I've cut it into three roughly 15 to 20 minute episodes. So that'll be the first three episodes of this. Let's call it a podcast because that's really what it is. And so what I'm going to show you through this channel and through my other platforms, social media, the blog on the website, those sorts of things, is exactly how I take this one long form piece of content and repurpose that into multiple pieces to build this repository, this body of proof that showcases how I solve these core problems for this specific audience. Because with episode 81, that's what we're doing, is we're helping professionals to take not just their experience, but their expertise, right? The things that make them valuable for their next employer around the problems that they will solve for that person. And we are building this repository of knowledge that when they're ready to make that move, all they have to do is point the gatekeeper of that next role in that direction. And they get sucked into this rabbit hole of learning more and more about, why this person is the right person for this role. So, if you want to come along on this journey with us, we're happy to have you. And without further ado, here's episode 1. All right, we have approved the roadmap, so let's get started.
Yep, we've got the roadmap locked. Whenever you're ready, let's start with the first subtopic. Tell me the story of when you first noticed this happening, when you realized that the version of you in conversation is fundamentally different from the version that ends up on the page.
All right, so actually the reason I first started this was because I had been noticing a bunch of content creators online who were producing content at scale, and the way they were doing it was they were either producing a podcast or they were going on other people's podcasts, and then they were using that as source material in order to create content at scale around the topics they wanted to talk about. And I was looking at that, and I had a blog for years. That was how I ran the content for my business when I was a freelance copywriter. And I started thinking it would be cool if I had my own podcast, right? And I knew that I wasn't established enough and I didn't have the cadence to be able to hold a podcast like on my own, right? That's just not in my wheelhouse yet. And so I started looking at AI and wondering if I could build a tool that could act as a podcast host for me. And I set that up and I've been through.
That's a great origin point. So you saw the pattern, conversation at scale as source material, and you built toward it because you knew solo podcasting wasn't your play. Before you finish that thought, when you started experimenting with AI as the host, what was the first thing that surprised you about how differently you answered questions compared to how you'd write the same ideas down?
As a writer, there's a whole process that goes into it, right? Yes, you do the research, but when you sit down to write, you start thinking automatically about structure and about the sort of things that go into how you're going to deliver this message effectively for the audience, which are all great things. But when you're in conversation, it's a little bit of a different feel, right? I think that when you sit down to write, that internal editor automatically pops its head out and said, all right, we got to make sure this looks polished so you don't embarrass yourself. And it can do everything from give you complete paralysis, so you never write anything, or it can go in other directions and strip away all of the things that mark you as an individual. And so you're using more elevated language than you would use in conversation. And you're avoiding specific metaphors or things that you would use in conversation to get your point across because you're second guessing how that might be seen as by your audience. So I think there are a couple of things at play here. One, you're having a conversation with another person, we'll say in this point, just because with AI, with conversational AI, it does actually feel a lot of times like you're talking to another person. But when you're talking to another individual, you're not worried about how all these people are going to see you, right? All these eyes are on you. You're having a genuine one-on-one interaction with the person on the other side of the table. And so you're less worried about how everyone is going to see you, and you're more interested in communicating effectively to that one person.
That's a really clean distinction. Writing feels like performing for a crowd, conversation feels like connecting with one person. Let me push on that a little further. Can you think of a specific moment, a phrase you said out loud, an analogy you used, a candid aside that came out of one of these AI conversations that, hand on heart, never would have made it onto the page if you'd been writing?
I don't know that I could say I never would have come up with it without when I was writing, but one of the things that I said, and I turned it into several pieces of content on LinkedIn, and I've mentioned it a couple of different times in different pieces, is the idea that when you're talking about experience versus a lot of people who are job seekers, they complain that I've got 20 years of experience, nobody wants to hire me. I don't get it, right? Why don't you want the benefit for my knowledge? And I think part of that is you're not actually giving examples of what the benefits of that knowledge actually are. You're just talking about your experience. And here's the quote: saying you have 20 years of experience doesn't tell people what you bring to the table. It only tells them how long you've sat there. And I like that a lot. I think it's fairly impactful. And yeah, it came out of one of those conversational moments. So
It only tells them how long you've sat there. That's the line. That's exactly what we're talking about. That kind of phrase doesn't survive the internal editor. It's too casual, too blunt, maybe even a little sharp. And that's precisely why it lands. How did it feel in the moment when that came out? Did you even register it as something worth capturing, or did you only recognize it later?
no, I recognize it as I said it, right? It's one of those things that you hear, and then once you actually hear it aloud, you're like, oh, that's actually pretty good, right? That's one of those rare moments where you spot that gem as it emerges out of the conversation.
Here's what I want to dig into next. You said you recognize it as it comes out, but most executives aren't trained to listen for that. They're just trying to answer the question. What's your theory on why some people catch those moments and others let them slip right past?
Like you said, some people just aren't trained for that. And I also think that conversation tends to be ephemeral, right? Once the words are out, they're gone. And so if you're not recording them, creating some sort of record of what's being said, then it's easy to have those moments, let them have the impact with that one person you're talking to, and then they might be gone. And then later you're trying to recapture or recreate that moment and try to remember exactly what it was you said. And so that can be part of it, right? Another part of it is if you say something and it is impactful and the other person registers and it hits them, and then it inspires them to ask that next question, and now you're off down this other rabbit hole. And so that moment may have a lot of impact with that person, but it may immediately pivot them down another rabbit hole and send them into content that leaves that back in distant memory as the conversation goes on. Let's see. Not sure why. This doesn't seem to be focusing on me very well. Maybe a little bit better.
So there are actually two problems stacked on top of each other. You have to catch the gem in real time, and then the conversation itself immediately buries it under the next exchange. That's a compelling case for why recording isn't optional. The whole infrastructure. Let me ask you this. When an executive comes to you and says, I don't have a content problem, I just don't have time to write, what do they not understand yet about what's actually going on?
All right, you and I have talked about this before a couple of times, but I tend to have two answers to that, right? One is if creating content in a strategic way is a way for you to build a repository that sets you up in the future as the ideal solution to a particular person's problem, right? And what you're doing now in bits and pieces is building up to that so that in the future, once you reach out to someone and they start trying to figure out who you are and they stumble upon this repository, and then there's all this evidence that they get to dive into that positioned you as that person. How do you not have time to invest in that for your future success? And that's my sort of empathetic answer, right? I get it. You're busy. It's difficult to carve out time. But what's the alternative is you get to that point where you're ready to take that next step and you're starting from scratch. You're starting from ground zero. How much time and effort is it going to take you to then convince the people you're trying to, the people who are gatekeeping that next role, that you're ready to move into that position? Now, I also have kind of a curmudgeonly, grumpy old man answer, which is, do you have time to watch NASCAR on Sundays? Do you have time to binge the Marvel Cinematic Universe or go fishing, right? And not begrudging anyone their hobbies or their pastimes or whatever they do for escapism. But if you can carve out 45 minutes to watch your show, now you're telling me you can't carve out 10 or 15 minutes to create a little bit of content, right? Now, on the other hand, I know that people are busy. And in other instances where you are too busy to do something that you know is essential, what do? You pay someone else to help you do that, right? Just because you can't seem to find the time doesn't mean that the time isn't there or there's not another solution to allow you to accomplish this.
I love that you have both answers ready, the empathetic one and the grumpy one. And honestly, the grumpy one might land harder because it's true and they know it. But let's sit on something you said in the first answer, starting from ground zero. Because I think that's actually the fear underneath the I don't have time objection. It's not really about time, it's about the size of the task feeling paralyzing. Is that what you're hearing when executives say they don't have time? Is I don't have time often a proxy for something else?
Yeah, so I find that most forms of putting something off or procrastination comes down to fear. And it can be fear of a couple of different things. One can be a fear of actually putting yourself out there. And that's why you don't want to do it, for fear of embarrassing yourself or having something proven wrong, or maybe you say something that comes across wrong to your audience and now there is a backlash. And so people try to find excuses not to do it to avoid that. Another might be a fear of coming off as conceited or egotistical, right? Nobody wants to hear me brag about myself. And so they play a humility card, whether it's legitimate humility or it's false humility. They'll use that as a reason for not taking action in that direction. Another thing is fear of looking stupid or not knowing what to say. And that's just a lack of strategy, right? So you don't have the planning invested in up front to give you a simple plan to follow day by day to help you organize and chunk those things and pre-plan those topics so you're not staring at the blank page, which as a professional copywriter, I came to learn that's just another form of procrastination. I know this isn't the most exciting thing to watch me doing it this way, but unfortunately that conversational back and forth mode just isn't quite there yet technologically. And I'll probably go through and edit a lot of this interstitial part of me interacting out.
That last line, staring at the blank page, is just another form of procrastination. When you think about the executives you're trying to serve, that these are people who have spent decades in boardrooms, on stages, and high-stakes conversations. They've been polished and professional their whole careers. Where do their rough edges actually live? What does rough edge even look like for someone at that level?
So let's look at some examples, right? Let's think of some high-level executives that have gained popularity over the years, right? You have Steve Jobs. He is someone who held himself with sort of poise and confidence when he's on the stage at the Apple product releases. But he's also known behind the scenes, even in that professional corporate environment, for being a bit of an asshole, right? And he didn't mind stepping on people's feelings in order to get his point across and to keep the entire company on brand and on mission, right? For better or for worse, right? But he had very clear angles that defined his personal brand, his personal executive brand. On the opposite end of that spectrum, you have someone like Dave Thomas, who was the founder of Wendy's, right? Who, from all reports, was probably one of the genuinely nicest, most nurturing people on the planet to ever hold a founder CEO position. And he was known as coming across as a genuine, down-home, good old boy persona. And that showed up not only in his own communication style, but was actually the core of the Wendy's brand for a long time. Has diverged from that when they started doing the Wendy's social media account, right? The Wendy's stuff on Twitter, which can be a little bit snarky and cutting, and had people begging Wendy to roast them. It kind of diverges from the Dave Thomas aesthetic. I'm not saying it's wrong. It was pretty good as far as building a brand. But Dave Thomas himself, he had a very clear sort of image of who he was as a person. Another example, you have someone like, let's say, Warren Buffett, right? He also seems to be a very soft-spoken, very down-to-earth, and seemingly humble individual. And that always comes across in his communication about investing and about wealth and about people in general, right? And even about companies and corporate ethics in general. And none of them feel like a generic, overly polished idea of what we think of as a suit, right? A corporate American suit or a typical corporate American executive. They all have very distinctive elements, hooks, edges, unpolished edges that help them stand apart from the classical generic idea of a corporate American executive.
Those three examples are doing a lot of work. Jobs, Thomas, Buffett, completely different textures, poisonous confidence, genuine warmth, quiet humility. But the thing they share is that none of them could be mistaken for anyone else. Here's what I want to push on. Those are titans. People whose rough edges became legendary partly because they had massive platforms that amplified them over decades. When a pattern starts to emerge, a recurring metaphor or a specific way someone explains something, do you flag it in the moment, or do you let it accumulate and surface it afterward?
That's the sort of thing that builds actually over time. The patterns don't typically emerge within a single conversation. They emerge over time as you dig deeper and deeper into these concepts. And ultimately, typically you speak of branding within the context of a company. And so a company's brand is the accumulation of the experiences that people have around dealing with your company or your product or your service, right? And so the same thing is true of your personal executive brand. It is the accumulated experience over time as they interact with you. And typically, if it's not an employee or a direct customer, the best way to provide those sort of interactions at scale is through creating content at scale over time.
So the brand isn't a declaration, it's a sediment. It builds up layer by layer through repeated interactions over time, which means the executives who are starting from scratch aren't actually behind. They're just at the beginning of the accumulation. And every conversation, every piece of content, every LinkedIn post is another deposit. Here's what I want to capture before we move on from this subtopic. You've talked about voice patterns emerging over time, the accumulation of brand through repeated interaction, and conversation as the fastest path to excavating what's already there. But let me ask you one more thing. What's the most surprising rough edge you've encountered in someone? A moment where you heard something come out of an executive's mouth and thought, that right there is your brand and you have no idea?
That's a really good question. There have definitely been some bad bosses I've had in the past who things had come out of their mouth over time that built up in a way that I'm like, you really seem like you are a terrible human being, right? And that's not the brand you want to build, intentionally or unintentionally. And yeah, he had some moments that were truly shocking that I won't go into here. But yeah, and for some reason, maybe because I didn't kowtow to his sort of bully techniques, he liked to manage through intimidation and fear, and I just didn't take to that. And so I guess because I didn't acquiesce to that sort of treatment, he took me into confidence in some very strange and sometimes uncomfortable ways. And he would say things, I'm like, you should not be saying this in front of anyone, especially me. And so he built a very clear brand. I don't think it was intentional the way he was doing it, but yeah, he did it just through the things he consistently did and said. And so he has a very clear brand in my mind, much probably to his dismay.
That's a perfect illustration of the flip side. Brand accumulates whether you're intentional about it or not. The only question is whether you're the author or the accident. And there's something important in what you just said. He built that brand through consistency, consistent behavior, consistent language, consistent choices under pressure. The executives you're serving are also building a brand through consistency right now. The question is whether that consistency is intentional and aimed or just happening to them. Let me do a quick recap of this subtopic before we move on. The rough edges aren't flaws, they're the fingerprints. Jobs' poisonous confidence, Thomas's genuine warmth, Buffett's quiet humility, that none of them are polished into genericness. Voice isn't invented, it's excavated through conversation over time. Brand is sediment, the accumulated experience people have with you, built deposit by deposit. And the most dangerous brand is the unintentional one, built through unconscious consistency that you never chose.
And so we'll stop episode 1 right here. Not the most polished beginning or ending because, as I said, this wasn't recorded as an end-to-end podcast, right? This is a section or a couple of sections of a much larger 71-minute brain dump, basically, that was used to get this content out of my head and into a format that was designed to be digested by my audience. And then I've used that to create these smaller, I guess, encapsulated episodes. that will be episodes 1, 2, and 3 of this podcast. So I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you got something out of it. If you have any questions, feel free to ask. And yeah, I guess if you have your own thoughts on executive branding or thoughts on the job search in general, right? Let's start the conversation in the comments below. And yeah, I look forward to talking to you. Thanks for hanging out with me.